Hello everyone, and welcome to part 4, the conclusion of this video series. In this part, we'll be implementing functionality for displaying a random quote and its author that we can see here at the top. To do this, we'll be using the Redux Saga middleware to help us manage async data fetching logic. First, let's review what the data flow looks like with a middleware. The Redux documentation has a pretty useful visualization of this. I'll put the link in the description of the video. So what's happening here? We still dispatch actions. However, when the action now reaches the middleware, it will make a call to an API and update the store with a response. I would recommend looking over this visualization a few times. When you're ready to begin, first enter the command npm install Redux Saga. Now let's do a bit of setup. In the store folder, create a new file and call it rootsaga.ts. The root saga is basically the entry point for the middleware. First, we'll need to import all from Redux Saga. Then we can export the default function called root saga. You'll notice that the function has a different notation because it's a generator function. I'll cover this more later on in the video. Inside the function, write yield all and enter an empty array. Later on, we'll actually enter a saga in here. Now let's navigate to the store.ts file. In this file, we'll actually need to create the Saga middleware. First, we can import create Saga middleware from Redux Saga. Then we can actually call this function. I'll create a variable called Saga middleware and then call create Saga middleware. When that's complete, we'll need to add this Saga middleware to the store we created inside this configure store. So we can add a middleware property, which takes a function as an argument. And we can write get default middleware dot concat saga middleware. The last thing we can do in this file is write saga middleware dot run and then pass in root saga that we created before. Next, let's open the Redux folder and create a quoteslice.ts file. In this file, the first thing we can do is create a type to define the state. So I'll call it interface quote state, and it'll have a single data property of type quote model. Remember, we've already created this quote model, which contains a text and an author, which are both strings. Then we can define the initial state, which is of type quote state. And we'll pass in an empty string for the text and the author to initialize it. Next, we can continue by calling the create slice function from Redux Toolkit, the same way we did in the to-do slice. For the name, we can call it quote, and we'll also pass in the initial state and one or more reducers. In our case, we only need a single reducer. We can call it setQuote, just to update the state with our API response that we get. Let's also import quote slice. And now we can add the reducer setQuote. The first argument is the state, and the next is an action. The action will be of type quote model. don't forget to import payload action. Now in the reducer, we'll first create a new quote. And that's coming from the action.payload. And then we can do state.data is equal to the new quote that we got from the payload. Then at the bottom of the file, remember to export first set quote, and lastly the reducer. Export default quote slice dot reducer. Now that we have a slice of state to hold data for the text and the author, we can focus on the data fetching logic. So let's create a folder called API. In this folder, create a new file and call it api.ts. For this tutorial, we can use a free REST API that I found. It returns an array of inspirational quotes. I'll put the link in the description of the video. Let's create a method called getRandomQuote. It'll be an async function, and it'll return a promise of type quoteModel. In here, we can create a variable for the URL and pass the URL of the REST API. Then we can write const response is equal to await fetch of URL. Then we can check the status of the response. If it's not okay, then we can throw an error. For the message, we can write something like, an error occurred fetching the quote. If it's okay, then we can get the quotes array. The type is an array of quoteModel equal to await response.json. Remember that the API returns a list of quote models. And then we can generate a random index. We can write math.floor and pass in math.random times quotes array.length. So this will pick a random item in the quotes array. And then we can return quotes array of random index. So what this does is first we call the API, we get an array of quotes, and then we choose a random one from that array. Now we can finally create a saga. In the Redux folder, create a new file and call it quotesaga.ts. In this file, let's create an action that will fire the saga. We can call it fetchQuoteAction. And we can call the createAction method from Redux Toolkit. For the type, we can call it quote/fetch. Let's also import the API helper method we created. We can import all as API. Now let's create what's called a worker saga. A worker saga is just a function to handle an action. Again, we'll see this generator function syntax. We don't need to know in too much detail what that is, because Redux Saga abstracts a lot of the complexity for us. But it's good to know that a generator function is just a function that can be exited and later re-entered. In particular, the yield keyword is used to pause and resume a generator function. Let's see what that looks like in Redux Saga. First, I'll have a try-catch block. And if there's an error, we can write console.error. An error occurred, fetching the quote. Then in the try block, we can write const quote equal to yield call api.getRandomQuote. So in more detail, the yield call instructs the middleware to call a function. In our case, we do a fetch to the quote API, and then we collect the result in this quote variable. Next, we can write yield put and pass in set quote. And then we can provide it with the quote variable. So in more detail here, the yield put instructs the middleware to schedule the dispatching of an action to the store. In our case, we dispatch the set quote action so that we can update the quote state with the response we get from the API. The last piece we'll need in this file is a watcher saga, which will look out for the fetch quote action and execute a worker saga when it sees one. So we can write function fetch quote saga, and in here write yield take latest. For the arguments, we can pass in fetch quote action dot type and then fetch quote. Redux Saga also offers powerful concurrency control. Right now we're using take latest, which does not execute concurrent actions, only the latest one. But if we were in a different scenario, and we wanted to execute actions concurrently, we can use something like take every. But in our case, take latest makes sense. Now that we've created the watcher saga, we're ready to register it in the root saga. So we can export default, fetch quote saga. Then let's navigate to the root saga.ts file and add it in here. Let's also not forget to add the quote slice to the Redux store. So let's navigate to the store.ts file and import the quote reducer. Then we can add this quote reducer to the store down here. The last step we need to do is modify the React components. Let's start with the quote component. We'll be using the useDispatch and useSelector hooks that we saw in the previous videos. So first we can write const dispatch is equal to useDispatch. And then we can subscribe to the Redux store with useSelector. So we can pass in the root state. And then select state.quote.data. And don't forget to import this quote model. Now we'll want to fetch the quote when this component is rendered, so we'll need to dispatch the fetch quote action. We can do this in a useEffect hook. In here, we can write dispatch, fetch quote action. And in the dependency array, we can add dispatch just to remove the warning. Next, we can remove these hard-coded values with data from the store. So we can replace this with data.text. And for the author, we can write data.author. And now the very last thing we'll need to do is just add this component to the app.tsx file. So in here, just add the quote. If you made it up to this point, congratulations. Now we have a functioning application that fetches data from an API. You'll see that every time we refresh the application, a new quote is displayed on the screen. We can also test that the to-do functionality is still working. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. I'll see you all in the next video.